The gun was already pressed against Kieran Ives's temple when Violet Tanner said the words that cracked something open inside his chest he hadn't known was still whole. "You're the only man I've ever trusted with the truth, and you've been lying to me from the very beginning." Her voice didn't shake. That was the worst part. He had seen Violet Tanner face down drought, debt, and the kind of grief that breaks most people in half, and her voice had never once trembled. It wasn't trembling now, either. It was cold and quiet and final, like the sound of a shovel cutting into winter ground. The man holding the gun was Cobb Reiser, and he was smiling the way a man smiles when he knows he's already won. "Go on, Violet," Cobb said pleasantly, pressing the barrel harder against Kieran's skull. "Tell him what we found in your barn. Tell him what your hired hand left behind when he thought no one was looking, the barn." Kieran's stomach dropped. The map. He had been so careful, he had been so painfully careful, and still it had come to this. Violet's green eyes were locked on his face, reading him the way she read the sky before a storm, looking for the thing she already suspected but desperately didn't want to find. "The map had your real name on it," she said. "Kieran Ives, not Kyle Morris. Not the drifter who showed up at my gate looking for honest work." She let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "Kieran Ives, the Cimarron ghost, the man who robbed 4 banks between here and Santa Fe. Violet, is it true?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, and the silence that followed it swallowed everything. Cobb pressed the gun harder. "Answer the lady." Kieran's eyes stayed on Violet's face. In the lamplight of her kitchen, with her dark hair loose around her shoulders and dust still on her cheek from the evening's work, she looked so fiercely herself that it physically hurt him to look at her. He had spent 8 months on this ranch lying about his name, his past, and his reasons for being here. He had told himself it was necessary. He had told himself she would never need to know. He had never accounted for the fact that he would fall so completely in love with her that the lying would become its own kind of agony. "Yes," he said, "it's true." Something moved across Violet's face. Pain, he thought. Or maybe the death of something she had been quietly hoping for, which was worse. Cobb pulled back the hammer of the revolver with a soft, decisive click. "Well then," Cobb said, "I suppose that settles it." It had started 8 months before, in the town of Redemption, New Mexico Territory, in the autumn of 1882, when Kieran Ives was 26 years old and running out of road. He had not always been the Cimarron ghost. There had been a time before the name, before the wanted posters, before the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from living your entire life at a full sprint toward the horizon. He had grown up outside of Taos, the son of a cattleman who lost everything to a drought the same year Kieran turned 17. And the loss had set something loose in him that he hadn't managed to recapture in 9 years of trying. He had fallen in with a crew of men who called themselves businessmen, and whose actual business was robbing stages and banks throughout the New Mexico and Colorado territories. He had been young and angry and hungry, and by the time he understood the full cost of what he'd become, he was already in too deep to climb out clean. He'd gotten out eventually. Not cleanly. There had been a confrontation in a town called Mora that left 2 members of his old crew in jail and 1 dead on the street. And Kieran had ridden north with blood on his hands, and a very clear understanding that the law would not be making fine distinctions between him and the men he'd left behind. The Cimarron ghost was already on wanted posters from Colorado to Texas. The reward was substantial. Every bounty hunter within 300 miles knew his face. Which was why, when he rode into Redemption, New Mexico, on a gray October morning with his hat pulled low and his horse barely holding together, he was not looking for work. He was looking for a way out. Redemption was a small town, the kind that existed primarily to service the ranches scattered across the surrounding plains. It had a general store, a livery, a saloon called the Silver Crown that was neither silver nor a crown, a land office, and a sheriff named Dunbar who was the observant kind. Kieran bought a meal at the eating house, ate it without making eye contact with anyone, and was preparing to ride on when he overheard the conversation that changed everything. Two ranchers at the next table. One of them was speaking loudly, the way men speak when they want to be overheard and are hoping someone will offer them sympathy. "Violet Tanner is going to lose that ranch before spring," the louder man said. He had a red face and the look of a man who is pleased by other people's misfortune. "4 hands quit on her this month alone. Nobody wants to work for a woman alone out there, not with Riser pushing for her land the way he is." "She's stubborn," the other man said. "Stubborn doesn't pay debts. The bank note's due in March. She can't run that operation with 2 hands and a 12-year-old boy." Kieran had told himself he was not interested. He had eaten his meal, left coins on the table, and walked out into the pale October sunlight. He had gotten as far as the livery before his feet slowed down, and his brain caught up with his conscience in an argument he already knew he wasn't going to win. A woman rancher alone. A powerful man pushing for her land. A bank note due in spring. He told himself he was only going to look. He would ride out to the Tanner ranch, get a sense of the situation, and then make a rational decision based on whether there was anything he could actually do without drawing attention to himself. He was a wanted man. He could not afford complications. He found the ranch 4 miles east of town, set back from the road behind a gate of weathered pine posts. The land was good land. He could see that immediately. The kind of soil that meant something if you worked it right, rolling slightly toward a creek to the south with a stand of cottonwood trees that would provide shade and water through the hot months. The house was well built, but showing its age, the white paint faded to the color of old paper, one shutter hanging slightly off its hinge. There were cattle in the far pasture, not many but healthy enough, and a kitchen garden on the south side of the house that was still producing late-season squash and dried bean plants rattling in the wind. The woman herself was on the roof of the barn. He had expected someone older. He didn't know why. The voice he'd overheard in the eating house had conjured someone weathered and defeated. Instead, Violet Tanner was perhaps 23 or 24 years old, with dark hair braided back from a face that was striking in its directness. And she was on the roof of her barn in a faded work dress with a hammer in her hand, replacing damaged shingles with the focused efficiency of someone who has learned to do everything themselves because there is no one else to do it. She heard his horse on the drive and looked down at him without pausing in her work. "If you're from Cobb Riser," she said, "you can turn around. The answer is still no." "I'm not from anyone," Kieran said. She studied him for a moment. The way she looked at him was unsettling, not fearful. More like a woman who has learned to assess threats quickly and accurately, and was still deciding what category he fell into. "Then state your business," she said. "I heard in town you were short on hands." "I'm short on hands," she agreed. "That doesn't mean I'm taking on drifters with no references and no history." "Fair enough," he said. He turned his horse and started back down the drive, and he had almost convinced himself this was the right decision, the only decision, when her voice followed him. "Wait." He stopped. "What's your name?" "Kyle Morris," he said, without hesitating. The false name came out smooth and easy, the way all his lies came out now, polished by repetition into something indistinguishable from truth. She came down from the roof with a confidence that suggested she'd been doing it for years, dusted her hands on her skirt, and walked to the gate to look at him properly. Up close, her eyes were green, a deep and serious green, and she had a small scar along her jawline from something he didn't ask about. "I can pay $2 a week," she said. "Room is in the bunkhouse. You'd be expected to work from sunup. I don't tolerate drinking on the property, and I make my own decisions about how this ranch is run. If you have opinions about that, find somewhere else." "Yes, madam," he said. He should have ridden on. He knew even then that he should have ridden on. "You can start tomorrow," Violet said. "Today you can fix that shutter." He had intended to stay 2 weeks, maybe 3, long enough to put some distance between himself and the trouble he'd left in Mora, long enough to let the trail go cold. He had a very clear plan, and the plan did not involve any significant emotional engagement with the woman who ran the ranch. The plan lasted approximately 10 days. The second hand at the Tanner Ranch was a man named Arlo Finch, who was somewhere in his 50s, and had the slow, deliberate quality of a man who has learned everything worth knowing and no longer sees any reason to hurry. He had been with the Tanner family since Violet's father had run the operation, and he stayed after Gerald Tanner's death 2 years before because he had nowhere else to be and because, Kieran eventually came to understand, he cared about what happened to Violet the way an old uncle cares about a niece. He was not the kind of man who asked questions, which suited Kieran perfectly. He was also not the kind of man who offered information about the ranch's troubles, which initially frustrated Kieran, and then came to seem like a form of loyalty he could respect. The 12-year-old boy from the eating house conversation turned out to be Violet's nephew, Tobias Garrett, who was staying at the ranch while his mother, Violet's sister, recovered from a difficult illness in Albuquerque. Tobias was serious-faced and industrious, and completely uninterested in being 12 years old in the conventional way. He had already decided he was going to be a rancher, and treated this ambition with a gravity that would have been more appropriate in a 40-year-old. He followed Kieran around for the first week, with the observant intensity of someone who is learning everything they can about a new subject, which was both useful and slightly alarming given that Kieran was deeply invested in not being studied too closely. "You're good with horses," Tobias told him on the 8th day, watching Kieran work through a problem with one of the mare's front shoes. Kieran said. "You're good with fixing things generally. You fixed the pump yesterday faster than Arlo could have. Arlo's got a bad shoulder. Still." Tobias thought about this. "You've done a lot of different kinds of work. Life takes you different places," Kieran said carefully. "Where did you come from?" "Before here," Kieran set down the mare's hoof and looked at the boy. "North," he said. "Come on, let's finish this before the light goes." It was the questions he couldn't answer that reminded him, regularly, of the fundamental wrongness of his being here. He had constructed a backstory that was plausible enough. A drifter from Colorado, some ranch work up there, some time spent in mining camps, nothing specific enough to be checked. He had a false name and a reasonable manner, and 8 months of practice at being someone else. But every time Violet asked him something direct, which she did, because she was direct in everything, he felt the lie between them as a physical presence, something solid and uncomfortable that he kept having to talk around. She was not easy to lie to. That was the problem. Most people were easy to lie to, because most people were predisposed to believe what they heard. Violet Tanner had learned to be skeptical of easy answers, and she watched the space between what people said and what they did with a precision that made Kieran, who was very good at presenting one thing while hiding another, feel consistently exposed in a way he couldn't fully explain. She had also inherited the ranch under circumstances that had given her a thorough education in betrayal. He learned this gradually in fragments, the way you learn anything about a person who guards themselves carefully. Gerald Tanner had run a solid cattle operation for 20 years. After his wife died, he had taken on a business partner, a man named Cobb Reiser, who had money and connections, and a particular interest in the land around Redemption that Gerald had not fully understood at the time. Reiser had maneuvered Gerald into a series of deals that, on their surface, looked like investments in the ranch, but were in reality a slow mechanism for transferring control. Gerald had died of a heart attack 2 years before Kieran arrived, and Violet had returned from a stay in Santa Fe, where she'd been working as a school teacher, to find that her father had borrowed significantly against the ranch in a way that she could not cleanly undo, and that Cobb Reiser was waiting, politely and patiently, for the whole thing to collapse. She had come back anyway. She had planted herself in the middle of the crisis the way a tree plants itself in difficult soil, because this was her father's land and her family's work, and she was not leaving it. Kieran learned all of this over the first 4 weeks, in pieces, in the evenings when the day's work was done, and she sometimes sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and talked to whoever happened to be nearby. She was not effusive. She did not tell her story in one dramatic unfolding. But she was honest, in the way people are honest when they're too tired to manage their honesty carefully, and the pieces added up. He had not expected to admire her as much as he did. He had, before this, had an uncomplicated theory of himself as someone who had made bad choices, and was largely responsible for his own predicament. He had not thought particularly much about the texture of a good person's life, the specific quality of someone who works hard and loves what they work for, and keeps going regardless of whether the world makes it easy. He had spent too long around men who treated integrity as a luxury and honesty as a liability to have much practice recognizing it up close. Violet Tanner had both in abundance, and being near her was, unexpectedly, like standing near a fire after a very long time in the cold. By the end of the first month, he had stopped thinking about leaving. He told himself this was practical. He was useful here, genuinely useful, and the Tanner Ranch needed someone who could do what he was doing. The south fence had been in poor repair, and he'd rebuilt 200 yards of it. The barn roof that Violet had been patching herself was now properly fixed. He'd identified a problem with the creek irrigation that was causing the hay fields to dry out in the wrong places and corrected it. These were real contributions, and Violet's operation was materially better for them. But that wasn't why he stayed, and he knew it, even if he wasn't prepared to say so out loud. In November, the cattle prices dropped unexpectedly, which meant Violet's fall sale generated less revenue than she'd projected, which meant the March bank note was going to be significantly harder to meet. Kieran heard about this from Outlaw, who was not a man who talked much but who on this particular evening was sitting on the bunkhouse steps looking older than usual. "How short is she?" Kieran asked. Outlaw named a figure. It was not catastrophic, but it was substantial, and combined with operating costs through the winter, it was the kind of gap that had a way of swallowing ranches. "She tell the bank, not yet. She'll work out every other option first." Outlaw paused. "That's how she is. She doesn't ask for help until she's already tried everything else." Kieran was quiet for a moment. "What about Reiser?" "He's waiting," Outlaw said. "He's been waiting for 2 years. He has access to the water rights on the eastern section. He bought them from Gerald before the old man understood what he was doing. He can make the ranch unworkable if he cuts off that access, and he knows it. Right now, he's just being patient." "What does he want?" "The land," Outlaw said. "He wants to consolidate the whole valley. Tanner land sits right in the middle of it." Kieran thought about this for a long time after Outlaw went inside. The next morning he was up before sunrise, which was not unusual, and he spent an hour in the barn with the mare he'd been retraining, which was where he went when he needed to think. The mare's name was Perdita, a name Violet had given her because she'd arrived at the ranch half wild and half starved from a careless owner, and Kieran had been quietly working with her for weeks, the way he worked with most difficult things, patiently and without drama, until the animal trusted him enough to respond. He thought about the map he had tucked into his saddlebag. It was a map of a canyon north of town that had been described to him, before he'd left his old life, as a place where certain arrangements could be made for a man who needed to disappear. Not a legal arrangement. The kind of arrangement that involved a new name, passage to California, and enough money to start over, provided you could bring something worth trading. He had been holding on to that map as an exit, a last option. He thought about Violet on the roof of her barn with a hammer in her hand. He put the map back in the saddlebag and went to feed the cattle. December brought cold, and with it, a complication Kieran had not anticipated. A man named Roy Haskett arrived in Redemption and took a room at the Silver Crown. Roy Haskett was a bounty hunter out of Colorado, and Kieran had encountered him once before, briefly, in a town called Cimarron, where Kieran had recognized the man's methods before the man recognized him and had gotten out ahead of it. Haskett was thorough and experienced, and had a financial interest in the Cimarron ghost that made him persistent in a way that most bounty hunters, who were often lazy, were not. Kieran heard about Haskett's arrival from Tobias, who had heard it from the general store owner's wife, and spent 2 days in a state of controlled tension that expressed itself externally as a focused and efficient work schedule that left him no time to stand still and be visibly afraid. He fixed everything on the property that needed fixing. He rode the fence line twice. He repaired the pump housing, replaced 2 window shutters, and cleaned out the storage lean-to that had been accumulating broken equipment for years. On the 3rd day, Violet found him in the lean-to at dusk and stood in the doorway watching him sort through the debris for a moment before she spoke. "Is there something wrong?" she said. "Just clearing things out," he said without looking up. "Kyle." The false name landed differently in her voice than it did in anyone else's. He looked up. "You've been moving since before sunrise," she said. "You've been doing the work of 3 men and you haven't sat down once. Something is wrong." He looked at her in the dimming light and felt the particular weight of the lie pressing down on him. She was watching him with that direct, assessing look, and he understood with sudden clarity that she had not built a successful ranch operation alone by being fooled by surface presentations. "I'm fine," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. "Supper's ready." She went back to the house, and he stood in the lean-to for a moment longer, looking at the space where she'd been, and felt something shift in his chest like a door opening onto a room he'd believed was sealed. He rode into Redemption that evening after supper on the pretext of collecting a package at the general store, timed it carefully, so he passed the Silver Crown at the right moment. Got a look at the man sitting at the front window with a glass of whiskey and a newspaper, confirmed it was Haskett, and rode back to the ranch knowing that he needed to be very, very careful. Haskett stayed in Redemption for 2 weeks. He made inquiries. He spoke to the sheriff and the livery man and several other people whose business put them in contact with the surrounding ranches. Kieran stayed close to the Tanner property during this time and arranged to be in the background whenever anyone from town came to the ranch, which was not often but happened occasionally. He was very good at being in the background when necessary. He had had 9 years of practice. Haskett left on a Wednesday. Kieran watched his horse disappear down the road toward the east and let out a long, slow breath that he felt all the way down to his boots. That evening, Violet found him at the paddock fence after supper, watching the horses move in the last light, and she came to stand beside him with a cup of coffee wrapped in both hands against the December cold. "The bounty hunter left," she said. He looked at her. "How did you know he was a bounty hunter?" Arlo told me. "He recognized the type." She looked out at the horses. "He was asking about a man called the Cimmerian Ghost." The silence that followed was very loud. "I've heard the name," Kieran said carefully. "So has most of the territory," Violet said. "Sheriff Dunbar says the man has a price on his head from 3 counties. She paused. "Dunbar also says the description is broad enough to fit half the drifters in New Mexico." She said this last part in the tone of someone reporting information without editorial comment, and Kieran chose to accept it at that value and said nothing. "I just thought you should know someone was asking," Violet said. She finished her coffee and went back inside. He stood at the fence for a long time after the light was gone, listening to the horses breathe and thinking about the kind of woman who would say exactly that, and nothing more. In January, Cobb Reiser came to the ranch. Kieran had not met Reiser yet, though he had formed a substantial picture of him from what he'd heard. He was a man in his late 40s, with the prosperous look of someone who has spent years building wealth through maneuver rather than work. He had the water rights and connections to the county land office, and a mortgage arrangement with the bank in Santa Fe that gave him leverage over several smaller properties in the valley. He was not the kind of villain who announced himself. He was the kind who brought you a very reasonable offer with a very friendly smile, and waited for you to run out of alternatives, before reminding you that his offer was the only one left on the table. He came in a good buggy with a driver and wearing a decent coat, and Kieran watched him from the barn doorway while Violet met him at the gate. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. Kieran could not hear it, but could read its general shape from the postures involved. Reiser was patient and pleasant and making an argument. Violet was still and unreceptive and making nothing, which was its own kind of argument. At the end of 20 minutes, Reiser handed Violet an envelope, which she did not open, and drove away in his good buggy. Violet stood at the gate for a moment after he left, then she walked to the barn. "His offer," she said, holding up the envelope. "Second time this month. What does he want to pay? 40 cents on the dollar for the property." She set the envelope on a post without opening it. "The land is worth significantly more than that. He knows it, I know it." She looked at Kieran. "He's betting I'll be desperate enough by March to take what he offers. And will you?" Her chin came up slightly. "No." "Then we need to find another way to close the gap on the note," Kieran said. She looked at him for a moment with something in her expression he couldn't immediately name. Not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. "We," she repeated. He realized what he'd said and felt the words sitting there between them, honest and exposed, without the careful neutrality he usually maintained about his relationship to the ranch's problems. He had meant to say you. He had meant to maintain the polite professional distance of a hired hand, someone who does the work and draws his wages and does not presume to a stake in the larger concerns of the enterprise. "If you want another approach," he said, adjusting, "there are a few options worth considering." She was still watching him with that expression. "Tell me," she said, he told her. He had been thinking about it for weeks, in the background of everything else, the way he thought about most problems, assembling pieces quietly until a shape emerged. The Tanner land had a large section of unimproved grazing on the northern edge that wasn't currently producing revenue. If they could strike a grazing arrangement with one of the larger operations before spring, the fee would contribute meaningfully toward the bank note. Separately, there was a market for dried chili in Santa Fe that the valley had not been utilizing. and the kitchen garden soil quality suggested it could support a significant produce expansion if planted correctly in spring. Neither of these would close the gap alone, but together with careful management of winter costs, they might be enough. Violet listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "You've been thinking about this," she said. "It's hard not to," he said. "When you're here." Another silence. She looked at the envelope on the post. "I'll contact the Morrow Ranch about the grazing," she said. "They've been expanding north anyway. It might suit them." She picked up the envelope without opening it and tucked it in her pocket. "Thank you, Kyle." She used his name the way she used all words, with a precision that made him feel, when she directed it at him, like being seen. The name that wasn't his name. The name he had given himself to be near her. He watched her walk back to the house and thought about the map in his saddlebag, and felt the distance between who he was pretending to be and who he actually was as a kind of constant, low-grade pain, the way a badly healed injury aches in cold weather. February brought two developments, both significant. The first was that Violet's grazing proposal to the Morrow Ranch was accepted. Lyle Morrow, who ran a substantial operation 12 miles to the north, had been looking for additional summer pasture, and the northern section of Tanner land was a sensible solution. The negotiated fee would cover a third of the outstanding bank note. It was not everything, but it was real, and it changed the mathematical shape of Violet's situation from impossible to difficult. The second development was that Arlo Finch had a fall from a horse while repairing the north fence, and broke his wrist badly enough that he was going to be largely out of commission for the remainder of the winter. This was not catastrophic, but it meant that Kieran was doing the work of two men, which was not in itself a problem since he was accustomed to sustained physical labor. But it meant that he and Violet spent significantly more time in proximity, because without Arlo's quiet presence as a third party, they were often simply the two of them working through the long winter days on whatever needed to be done. He learned her during those weeks in the specific way you learn someone through work. She was methodical and competent, and had strong opinions about how things should be done that were generally correct, and that she was not interested in compromising for the sake of a hired hand's comfort. She knew the land with an intimacy that came from having grown up on it, which direction each field drained in heavy rain, where the soil turned rocky 30 inches down and wouldn't hold a fence post without extra work, which of the cattle had temperament problems and needed to be handled carefully. She talked to the horses in a low, unsentimental voice that was different from the precise way she talked to people, more personal somehow. She was also funny, in a dry and understated way that surprised him every time it emerged, because her default presentation was so serious that the moments of humor arrived like sunlight through cloud cover, abrupt and warm. He found himself watching for those moments in a way that was becoming difficult to pretend was anything other than what it was. She saw it. He knew she saw it. She was too perceptive not to. But she did not address it, and he could not address it, because addressing it would have required a level of honesty that his real situation made impossible. He was a wanted man living under a false name on this woman's property. Whatever he felt about her was irrelevant to that foundational fact. He told himself this frequently. It did not stop him from feeling it. One evening in late February, 2 weeks before the banknote was due, they were working late in the barn on a difficult calving, and when it was over and the calf was standing unsteadily on new legs and the cow was recovered, they were both tired in the particular way that comes from sustained, concentrated effort, and they sat against the stall wall in the hay for a moment without talking. "My father built this barn himself," Violet said after a while. "I helped him when I was 8. I thought it was the most important thing I had ever done." Kieran looked at the barn in the lamplight. "It's a good barn." "He was a good man," she said. "A better rancher than a businessman." Reiser knew that when he approached him. She was quiet for a moment. "I was away at school when it started. I didn't know until I came back and found the ledgers." He looked at her. In the warm lamplight of the barn, with hay in her hair and exhaustion in her face, she looked entirely real in a way that was almost impossible to be around without feeling something enormous and uncomfortable. "You came back anyway," he said. "Where else would I have gone?" She said this as if it were the simplest question in the world. "This is mine, my father's work, his father's land before that." She looked at the calf. "I'm not letting Cobb Reiser have it." The force of feeling in her voice was quiet but absolute, and Kieran understood in that moment with great clarity that this woman was not going to lose this ranch because of the effort she brought to keeping it. She was going to lose it or not lose it based on the arithmetic of money and power and legal leverage, and the arithmetic was still not fully in her favor. He looked at his hands. "Violet," he said. She looked at him. He wanted, very badly, to tell her the truth. The name, the past, the reason he had come here and the reason he had stayed. He wanted to put the full weight of it down between them and see what happened. He had been carrying it for months and it had gotten heavier every week, and the weight of it now was almost unbearable. He thought about Haskett. He thought about the warrant with his name on it. He thought about what it would mean for this woman and this ranch if it became known that she had been employing a man wanted for bank robbery across 3 counties, and what Cobb Reiser would do with that information. "Thank you," he said instead, "for letting me stay." It wasn't what he had meant to say. He could see from the slight shift in her expression that she knew it wasn't either, but she did not push him. "Thank you for staying," she said. "The banknote was paid in the 2nd week of March." It was paid through the combination of the Morrow grazing fee, 3 months of careful expense management, and the sale of 6 head of cattle that Violet had been reluctant to sell, but had ultimately concluded she could not afford to keep through another winter. The figure came out almost exactly right, which was either very good planning or very good luck, and Kieran suspected it was mostly planning, because Violet had been working those numbers since November. He was in the yard when she came back from the bank in redemption. She drove the wagon herself, which she always did. She pulled up at the house, set the brake, and sat for a moment in the seat with the expression of someone who has just set down something very heavy. Then she looked at him and said, "It's done." The relief in her voice was something he felt in his own chest. "Good," he said. She climbed down from the wagon and went inside, and Kieran stood in the yard for a moment looking at the ranch in the late afternoon light. The house and the barn and the good pasture land and the cottonwood trees along the creek, and thought about how much it would hurt, eventually, to leave all of this. Spring changed things. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the accumulative way that seasons change things, a degree at a time, until one morning you realize the world is entirely different from what it was. The kitchen garden that Violet expanded produced better than expected. The south pasture greened up early, and Arlo's wrist healed enough that he was back to partial duty, which meant Kieran was no longer the only functioning pair of hands, and the pace of the work became, slightly, more sustainable. What also changed was the quality of the time between him and Violet, which had been moving since the February night in the barn, in a direction that neither of them was officially acknowledging, but that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. She had begun saving him the last cup of coffee in the evenings. This was a small thing, a practical thing, he told himself. There was coffee at the end of the day, and she poured the last of it before he could say anything and handed it to him, and that was all. But she did it every evening and had been doing it for weeks, and it felt, each time, like something intentional. He brought her flowers once. This was not planned. He had been riding the north fence line and found a stretch of land where the first spring wildflowers were coming up, and he had picked a handful without thinking about it, and then had spent the entire ride back constructing reasons why this was a perfectly professional and insignificant thing for a hired hand to do. He left them on the porch railing. She did not mention them, but she put them in a glass of water on the kitchen windowsill. And the next time he had occasion to be in the kitchen, he saw them there, and said nothing, and she said nothing, and the absence of conversation about the flowers somehow communicated more than a conversation would have. Tobias, who was 12 and observant in the relentless way of 12-year-olds, watched all of this with visible interest. "You like my aunt," he informed Kieran one afternoon, as a statement of fact rather than a question. "Your aunt is a fine rancher," Kieran said. "That's not what I meant. Get the south fence posts in before the ground gets hard again." Tobias went, but he was clearly unconvinced. The complication, when it came, arrived in the shape of a man named Devlin Stokes, who rode into Redemption in April and began asking questions. Stokes was not a bounty hunter. He was something potentially more dangerous, which was a detective employed by the First National Bank of Colorado, which was one of the 4 banks that the Cimarron Ghost had robbed over the past several years. The Colorado robbery had been the most recent and the most significant, and the bank had invested in a private inquiry. Stokes was thorough and methodical and patient, the kind of investigator who doesn't need to find you immediately because he is confident in his eventual ability to find everyone. Kieran became aware of Stokes through Sheriff Dunbar, who was not a corrupt lawman, but was also not the type to put himself out in the service of a private banking interest over a territorial warrant. Dunbar mentioned, at the general store where Kieran had gone for supplies, that there was a bank detective staying at the Silver Crown, and that said detective had been inquiring about recent arrivals in the area. Kieran paid for his supplies and rode back to the ranch at a pace that he kept deliberate so as not to attract attention, and spent the ride thinking through his options with the kind of focused, cold clarity that had gotten him out of trouble in the past. He could run. This was the obvious option and the one that his better judgment argued for with some force. He had been here 6 months. The trail was going to catch up with him eventually, and the longer he stayed, the greater the risk that when it did, it would catch Violet in it as well. He should take his horse and his saddlebag and disappear before Stokes got anywhere near the Tanner Ranch. He went through his reasons to run methodically and arrived at the barn and put up the horse, and then went to find Violet, who was in the kitchen garden with her hands in the soil, planting the beans she'd been waiting on for the last frost to pass. She looked up when he came to the garden fence. "Everything all right?" she said. "Fine," he said. He looked at her in the April afternoon with the new green of the garden around her and the light she had in her face when she was doing something she loved, and he thought, "I am not leaving." It was not a rational decision. He was aware of this. He made it anyway. In May, Cobb Reiser escalated. Violet had known he would. The payment of the bank note had not deterred Reiser, it had merely rerouted him, and what he tried next was more direct. He sent 2 men to the ranch on a weekday morning to inspect the irrigation diversion on the Eastern Creek section, the section where he held the water rights, and to inform Violet that he was considering restricting the access due to concerns about overuse. Violet met them at the fence with a calm that Kieran recognized as the stillness before a decision, not passivity but the moment before action. He was nearby, working at the barn, and he moved to a position where he was visible without being obviously present. The men delivered their message. Violet heard it out. She said that the water usage had been consistent with the arrangement her father had made, that she had documentation to that effect, and that Mr. Reiser was welcome to review that documentation at any time through the appropriate legal channels. The men left. Violet came to the barn after. She was holding herself very straight, which was what she did when she was genuinely shaken and not willing to show it. "He's going to try to cut off the eastern section," she said. "We knew he would eventually," Kieran said. "If he cuts the irrigation to the east pasture, I lose nearly a third of my summer grazing." She ran a hand over the fence post. "The cattle numbers I need for the fall sale won't be there," Kieran thought. "Who drew up the original water rights arrangement?" "A lawyer in Santa Fe." "Reiser's lawyer. The documentation you mentioned, what does it actually say?" She looked at him with a slight frown. "The terms specify access for standard agricultural use. The definition of standard is somewhat vague." "Who has copies of the original?" "I have one." "The county land office should have another. And Reiser." Kieran was quiet for a moment. "There's a lawyer in Redemption, Marbury. He handles land disputes." He had done his research quietly over the winter months, the way he researched everything in places where he might need to know the exits. "He's not connected to Reiser. He might be worth talking to about what the agreement actually allows versus what Reiser can actually enforce." Violet considered this. "That costs money." "A consultation might not cost much, and if there's something in the language he can use, it might be worth it." She was quiet for a moment, still holding herself very straight. Then she let out a breath and her shoulders came down slightly, the way they did when she had reached a decision. "I'll go tomorrow," she said. He went with her. This was not the plan. The plan was that she would go to town and he would stay at the ranch. But in the morning she hitched the wagon and drove it to the barn door and looked at him and said, "Come on." And that was that. Riding to Redemption beside her in the wagon on a warm May morning was a specific kind of pleasure that Kieran stored away carefully. The way you store things you know you will need to remember later. The road ran through good country, open plains with the mountains showing to the west and the sky enormous and blue above it all. And Violet drove with the ease of long practice and talked about the ranch and the summer's plans, and asked his opinion on the grazing schedule in a way that made clear she actually wanted it. He gave it, honestly. He had, by this point, 8 months of intimate knowledge of the operation and strong opinions about its management. And she listened to these in the same way she listened to everything, with full attention, and the evident intention of evaluating the information on its merits rather than its source. "You're very good at this," she said at one point. "Ranching." "I've picked things up," he said. "You've done more than pick things up." She was looking at the road ahead. "You think about it the way someone thinks about something they care about, not just the work, the land." He looked at the plains rolling out to the west and felt the truth of this settle into him with a quiet permanence. He did care about it. He had not expected to, but he did. "It's easy to care about good land," he said. She looked at him briefly. "Yes," she said, "it is." In Redemption, the lawyer Marbury reviewed the water rights documentation and spent an hour going through the original agreement. He was a deliberate man who chose his words with care and said that, while the language was vague in places, the precedent of 2 years of consistent use would be difficult for Reiser to challenge without showing material harm, and that a challenge to the restriction could likely be mounted if Reiser moved forward with it. Violet thanked him and paid his modest consultation fee, and they walked out of his office into the May sunlight. She was quiet for half a block. Then she said, "I feel better. Good. I feel like I might actually keep this ranch." The way she said it, The simple directness of it, the unsentimental acknowledgement of how close it had been and how much it mattered, made him stop walking. She turned to look at him. "You will," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. There was something in her expression he had been watching approach for months, something certain and careful and irreversible. The square was empty in the midday heat, a dog asleep in the shade of the hardware store, a horse tied at the post in front of the Silver Crown, nobody to see them standing there in the sun. "Kyle," she said. "Violet." The silence had a particular quality, full of everything that hadn't been said for months. "I need you to tell me something true," she said, his chest constricted. "What do you want to know? Why you stayed?" She was looking directly at him. "Not the work, not because I needed the hands. Why you, specifically, stayed here when you could have moved on months ago." He looked at her face in the sunlight. The green eyes, the scar along her jaw, the particular way she held herself that was neither soft nor hard but something entirely its own. "Because of you," he said. The words were so completely honest that they felt strange in his mouth, like speaking a language he'd only ever translated before, never actually spoken. She didn't look away. "All right," she said quietly. And she turned and walked toward the wagon, and he followed her, and they drove back to the ranch without speaking much. But the quality of the silence was entirely different from what it had been before. June arrived like an argument resolved, warm and certain. The east pasture was green with the irrigation flowing as it should be, Riser having apparently decided that a legal challenge on the water rights was not worth the cost at the moment. The cattle were healthy. The kitchen garden was producing lavishly. Tobias, who would be returning to his mother in Albuquerque at the end of the month, had spent the last weeks of his stay learning to rope from Arlo, and had achieved a level of competence that pleased him enormously. Things between Kieran and Violet moved in the way things move when two people have acknowledged the truth between them and are still figuring out what to do with it. They were closer than they had been. They talked more openly. She asked his opinion on things beyond the purely practical. He told her more about his thoughts and observations than the careful version of himself would have shared. They stood nearer to each other than was strictly necessary. Once, when she was showing him a problem with the hay baler mechanism, and they were both bent over the machinery with their heads close together, she had looked up and found his face very near hers, and neither of them had moved for a moment that stretched out considerably longer than it needed to. He had not kissed her. He was very aware that he should not kiss her, that kissing her would move things past a point of no return that was already difficult to manage, that his situation was still what it had been, and the fundamental dishonesty at the center of it was still there, solid and unresolved. He had also not told her the truth. He had come close several times. Each time the calculation of consequences stopped him, not fear for himself or not primarily, fear of what it would mean for her. A woman alone, already fighting for her land with a wanted man employed at her ranch. Riser would use it. Stokes was still in the area. The whole fragile structure of what she'd built, the banknote paid, the water rights preserved, the summer cattle healthy, all of it could come apart if the wrong person connected Kyle Morris of the Tanner Ranch to Kieran Ives of the wanted posters. But the weight of the lie was becoming unbearable. That was the truth he kept coming back to. He was falling in love with this woman, was perhaps already entirely in love with this woman, and every single day he spent with her was built on a false foundation. The night in late June when he finally made his decision to tell her was also, by a terrible timing, the night Cobb Riser decided to escalate beyond legal maneuver. Kieran had ridden out to check on the South cattle after supper, a regular evening task, and was riding back in the last of the light when he saw the smoke. It was coming from the direction of the barn. Not a large fire yet, not engulfing, but smoke. And smoke near a barn in summer meant everything could be gone in 20 minutes. He put his horse to a hard run. When he reached the yard, he could see the fire had started at the barn's back wall, dry wood taking quickly, and it was already up into the eaves on the south side. Violet was there before him. He could hear her voice calling to the cattle, and Arlo was already at the water pump. Kieran came off his horse at a run and took over from Arlo at the pump, while Arlo moved the cattle that were in the adjacent paddock to a safe distance. They fought it for 40 minutes. The south wall was lost. But the structure itself held, the main frame, the roof, because the fire had started on the exterior, and the summer air was dry rather than windy, and they had enough water and enough arms. And eventually, what they had was a blackened south wall and a barn that was damaged but standing. Violet stood in the yard afterward and looked at the damage. Her face in the firelight was absolutely still. Kieran stood beside her. His hands were burned in 2 places, not badly, but he could feel it. Deliberately set, she said. It was not a question. The back wall, that far from any lamp or lantern, Kieran said. Yes. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, there was something in her face that was harder and more resolute than anything he had seen there before. I have to go to the sheriff tomorrow, she said. And I have to prove it. The day after the fire, Kieran rode to Redemption and back twice, once with Violet to speak to Dunbar, who was grimly interested but cautious about what he could prove without a witness, and once alone in the evening to have a conversation he had been preparing for. He found Devlin Stokes at the Silver Crown. He had known Stokes was still in the area because he had been tracking the man's movements with the same careful attention he had given to Haskett in December. Stokes was at a corner table with a glass of water and papers spread in front of him, and he looked up when Kieran sat down across from him. Stokes was perhaps 40, with a precise, careful face and the quality of stillness that distinguishes a truly patient man from a merely slow one. I know who you are, Kieran said. He said it quietly. And you're close to knowing who I am, so let's have a direct conversation. Stokes put down his pen. All right, he said, equally quietly. What Kieran proposed was something he had thought through very carefully. He was prepared to make restitution to the Colorado Bank. He had access to money, specifically the money from the Mora job that he had kept as his exit fund, and it was enough to cover a substantial portion of the Colorado loss, perhaps all of it. In exchange, he wanted Stokes to take that restitution to the bank and make the argument that further pursuit was not in the bank's financial interest, not with court costs and the uncertainty of territorial jurisdiction. He was not asking Stokes to lie. He was not asking Stokes to let him off the other warrants. He was proposing a specific, limited arrangement with a specific financial institution. Stokes listened to all of this without expression. And the other warrants, Stokes said. Those aren't your problem, Kieran said. Your employer is the Colorado Bank. Stokes thought about this. I'd need to take it to the bank, he said. They'd have to agree to withdraw the private warrant. Yes. That doesn't touch the territorial warrants. No, Kieran agreed. It doesn't. Stokes was quiet for a long moment. Why? He said. Why now? Kieran thought about the blackened south wall of Violet's barn. There are things worth protecting, he said. He rode back to the ranch in the dark and lay awake in the bunkhouse for most of the night thinking about territorial warrants and Cobb Riser and the map in his saddlebag, and the look on Violet's face when she'd stood in the yard looking at the damage. He was still awake when the decision crystallized fully. He needed to tell her. Not to manage the situation, not because of any strategic calculation, but because he could not continue being a lie in the middle of this woman's true life. She deserved the truth. He deserved to carry it honestly rather than in this exhausting concealment. And whatever happened after, it was better than another day of the pretense. He had planned to tell her in the morning carefully, with time to explain everything properly. Instead, Cobb Reiser's man found the map that afternoon. Reiser had sent someone to search the bunkhouse while both Kieran and Outlaw were in the far south pasture. It was opportunistic and illegal, and the kind of thing Reiser did because he was the kind of man who recognized no rules that his money couldn't manage the consequences of. The man had gone through the bunkhouse and found Kieran's saddlebag and opened it, and found, along with the honest contents, the map with Kieran's real name written in his own hand in the corner of it. A foolish sentimentality he had allowed himself, because the map was supposed to be his private thing, his own record of the escape route he had never taken. The man brought the map to Reiser, and Reiser arrived at the Tanner Ranch that evening with 2 men and Roy Haskett, who had apparently returned to the territory, and they found Violet in her kitchen, and they told her what they had found. That was the moment that Kieran walked in through the kitchen door. He had come in from the pasture and seen Reiser's buggy, and known immediately that something had gone terribly wrong, and the feeling in his chest as he crossed the yard was unlike anything he had experienced in 9 years of dangerous living, because for 9 years the only thing he'd been protecting was himself, and this was different. He opened the kitchen door and saw Violet's face and saw the map on the table and saw Haskett with the revolver, and understood completely and immediately the shape of what was happening. And then Violet said the words that cracked him open. "You're the only man I've ever trusted with the truth, and you've been lying to me from the very beginning." The gun was at his temple. Reiser was smiling. Violet's green eyes were on his face, and he said yes. He said yes. It's true, because the lying was done, and whatever came next was going to begin from this moment of truth. Reiser, it turned out, had made a significant strategic error. He had brought Haskett because Haskett was a bounty hunter, and having a wanted man on Violet Tanner's property was, in Reiser's plan, sufficient leverage to force a sale. She would not want the scandal of it. She would not want the sheriff involved, not with the liability of having unknowingly employed the Cimmerian ghost. She would take the deal he offered, and he would have the land before July. What Reiser had not accounted for was Violet Tanner's specific and inflexible relationship with being told what to do. Haskett moved Kieran to a chair. Reiser laid out his position pleasantly. The gun was holstered now, the immediate violence having served its purpose. He showed Violet the map and the wanted poster and explained, in his reasonable way, that the situation gave her a choice. Sign the land over at the terms he'd been offering for 2 years, or he'd make sure Sheriff Dunbar knew that she'd been employing a wanted criminal under a false name. Violet looked at Reiser, then she looked at Kieran. Kieran did not look away, she looked back at Reiser. "Get out of my house," she said. Reiser blinked. "Violet, this is my property and you are here without invitation and without legal authority, and you are going to leave." Her voice was very quiet and very absolutely certain. "I will deal with the other matter on my own terms. You have nothing. You have a map and a wanted poster, and you committed trespass and possibly arson on this property. Take your men and your bounty hunter and leave." Reiser's pleasant expression cracked slightly. "You're not thinking clearly." "I am thinking precisely clearly." She went to the door and opened it. "Sheriff Dunbar is going to be very interested in a signed statement from my ranch hand Outlaw Finch about the men who set fire to my barn. Outlaw's memory is very good. He recognized one of your riders." This was, Kieran realized, not a bluff. She had known this. She had been holding it. Riser stared at her for a long moment. The calculation behind his eyes was visible. Then he picked up his hat and nodded to his men and walked out. Haskett followed, but at the door he paused and looked at Kieran. "The territorial warrants are still active," Haskett said. "I know," Kieran said. Haskett left. Violet closed the door and stood with her back to it and her hand flat on the wood for a moment. Then she turned around. They looked at each other across the kitchen. "Arlo did see one of Riser's men," she said. "That part was true. And the rest," he said, "the rest was a measured risk." She came to the table and sat down across from where he was sitting. The map was between them. She looked at it. "Tell me," she said. "All of it." So he did. He told her everything. Not the managed version, not the story he'd constructed over months to be plausible, but the actual truth in its entirety. Tao's, the drought, his father's loss, the crew he'd joined at 17 and the years that followed. The robberies and the warrants and the name. Mora and the men he'd left in jail and the one who hadn't made it. The ride south. The eating house in Redemption and the conversation he'd overheard. The decision to come to the ranch, which had been impulsive and poorly thought through, and the decision to stay, which had been deliberate and entirely her fault. And he said that last part without softening it. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Her face went through things he watched carefully, not to manage, but because he wanted to see them, the pain and the anger and the complicated work of reassessing everything she'd believed about the last 8 months. When he was done, the kitchen was very quiet. "The work you did," she said. "The help with the bank note, the grazing arrangement, the lawyer, was that because you felt guilty? Some of it at first," he said honestly. "By November it was because I wanted to, because I cared what happened to this place." "Because you cared what happened to me," she said. "Yes." She looked at the map for a moment. "Do you love me?" The directness of it, the absolute Violet Tanner directness of asking the thing most people would circle for months, made him close his eyes briefly. "Yes," he said. She was quiet for a long time. He did not try to fill the silence. "I'm so angry with you," she said. "I know. I trusted you with more than I have trusted anyone since my father died, and you were lying about your name. Yes, and I have to decide what to do with that." She looked up at him. "The warrants are real." "Yes." "What did you do in Redemption 2 days ago? I know you went somewhere that wasn't the hardware store." He was not surprised she had noticed. He told her about Stokes. She was quiet while she processed this. "You offered to make restitution." "The Colorado bank is the one with the private investigation. If the private warrant is withdrawn, there's less active pursuit. The territorial warrants are older and understaffed." "That doesn't make them not real." "No," he said. "It doesn't." She stood up and went to the window. Outside, the summer evening was settling into the long blue dusk of the territory, and the sound of cattle from the south pasture came faintly through the open kitchen window. "I need you to do something for me," she said, without turning around. "Anything," he said, and meant it. "I need you to go to Sheriff Dunbar tomorrow and tell him the truth. Your name, your warrants, the whole thing." He was very still. "That might result in arrest. I know." She turned around. "But Dunbar is not a corrupt man, and the territorial system is slow, and if you come forward voluntarily, that is different from being brought in. And I will speak for you, about the work you've done here and the character you've shown. And Arlo will speak for you. And Marbury the lawyer will hear your case. You do that," he said, not a question, just the enormous fact of it settling around him. "I'm not going to stand by and watch someone go to prison when I could help," she said. "That's not who I am." She paused. "And I'm not going to pretend I don't know that you are a good man who made bad choices a long time ago and has been trying to become someone different, Violet." "That's not forgiveness," she said quickly. I'm still angry. I'm going to be angry for a while. But it's also the truth, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't." He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp was lit on the table, and the map was between them, and outside the ranch was quiet in the summer dusk. And this woman, who had every reason to send him away and protect herself from the complication of his existence, was instead telling him exactly what she thought was true with her characteristic and devastating honesty. "I'll go to Dunbar tomorrow," he said. "Good," she said. She picked up the map. She looked at it for a moment, then folded it and handed it to him. "This is yours." He took it. "Thank you, go to bed," she said. "Tomorrow is going to be a long day." He went to the bunkhouse and lay in the dark and felt something he hadn't felt in 9 years, which was the specific quality of being known by someone and found, if not entirely acceptable, then at least worth the effort of understanding. The meeting with Sheriff Dunbar lasted 3 hours. Kieran had expected hostility and got instead a careful and deliberate lawman who was interested in the full picture before he formed a conclusion. He asked clear questions and listened to the answers. He sent a telegram to the county seat in the afternoon and received a reply by early evening. And the reply contained information that Kieran's attorney Marbury, who was present by this point, found significant. The Mora incident, which had been the most violent in Kieran's history, had resulted in charges against the 2 men taken alive. In the course of those proceedings, both men had given testimony that identified Kieran's role in the group accurately. He had been present at the robberies, but had not been the architect of the violence and had, in at least 2 documented instances, actively prevented it. This was not exoneration. But it was context, and context mattered. The Colorado bank withdrew the private warrant. Stokes sent the telegram himself. The territorial warrants were more complicated. There were 3 of them. Marbury argued, carefully and over several weeks of correspondence with the territorial court, that voluntary surrender and restitution should be considered in sentencing, that the warrants predated the Mora testimony, and that the character evidence available was substantial. Violet submitted a signed statement of 7 pages that Kieran was not permitted to read, but that Marbury said was the most thorough character testimony he had seen in 20 years of law. The final resolution, which came in September, was 2 years of supervised labor in lieu of incarceration, a fine that Kieran paid through the exit fund money and that very nearly emptied it, and a formal probationary period during which he was required to remain in the county and report monthly to Sheriff Dunbar. It was not nothing, but it was not prison. He was on the porch of the Tanner ranch house when Marbury rode out to tell him, and Violet was standing behind him in the doorway, and when Marbury finished and rode away, Kieran sat on the porch step for a long moment without saying anything. Then Violet sat down beside him. "Well," she said. 2 years, he said. "You're going to have to stay in the county," she said. "Yes." She looked out at the ranch. "I don't suppose you have other prospects." He turned to look at her. The anger had been there all summer, steady and honestly expressed, never suppressed, never weaponized. She had been clear about it and clear about what she needed from him, and he had tried to give her exactly what she asked for, including the truth and the Dunbar meeting and everything after. She had not told him she forgave him. She had kept working beside him through the whole summer, with a slight new distance that he had accepted without complaint, and had made her position absolutely clear. The anger was real and the care was also real, and she was deciding, every day, what to do with both. "What are you asking me?" He said. "I'm asking if you want to keep working here," she said. "Formally this time, I'll pay you properly and there won't be any more false names." She paused. "Kieran." His actual name in her voice. He had not heard it said by anyone who knew him in years, and the way she said it, plainly and without drama, was the most intimate thing he had ever experienced. "Yes," he said. "I want to stay." She nodded. She looked back at the ranch. Then, almost experimentally, she put her hand over his where it rested on the step. He turned his hand over and held hers carefully, like something he had been given to take care of. They sat on the porch together in the September evening, and the ranch was quiet around them, and for a long time neither of them said anything at all. In October, exactly 1 year after Kieran had ridden down the Tanner Ranch drive for the first time, Violet came to find him at the paddock after supper. She came across the yard in the last of the evening light, and he watched her come and thought, as he had thought for a year, that she was the most entirely real person he had ever been near. She stopped at the fence. "I'm done being angry," she said. He looked at her. "Are you sure?" "I've been deciding for months," she said. "It takes me a long time to decide things. That's not a flaw." She paused. "I'm sure." He opened the paddock gate and stepped out to the yard, and they stood together in the October evening. And when he kissed her for the first time, it was with the full awareness of everything it had cost to get here. His past and her trust and the year between them, and all the honesty that had had to happen before this particular moment was possible. She kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything, and when they separated she looked up at him and said, "You're going to have to learn to be honest when it's uncomfortable." "I know," he said. "I mean about small things too, not just the big ones." "I know. Good." She took his hand. "Come inside. Supper's getting cold." He followed her toward the house with her hand in his, and Perdita came to the paddock fence and watched them go, and the territory was enormous and dark beyond the ranch lights, and he did not look back at it. The 2 years of supervised labor passed. They were not difficult years, or they were difficult in the ordinary way of working land through seasons, which is the kind of difficulty that produces something rather than taking it away. He and Outlaw rebuilt the south wall of the barn through the autumn, doing it right, using good timber that Kieran sourced from a mill north of Redemption. Tobias came back for the following summer with his mother, who had recovered, and spent 3 months being taught to ride properly by both Outlaw and Kieran and achieving, by August, a competence that genuinely pleased everyone. Cobb Riser did not disappear. He was that kind of man, the persistent variety, and he continued to hold the eastern water rights and to wait. But Outlaw's testimony to Dunbar about the arson, combined with additional evidence that Marbury assembled over the fall, produced a county investigation that cost Riser both money and reputation. He pulled back from active harassment of the Tanner Ranch, and while Kieran did not imagine he had given up entirely, the operational threat receded. On a Sunday in November of 1884, 2 years and 1 month after Kieran Ives had first come to the Tanner Ranch under a false name with nowhere left to go, he and Violet were married in Redemption by the circuit preacher who came through the territory once a month. It was not a large event. Outlaw was there, in a clean shirt, standing the way he stood at everything, with quiet and steadfast presence. Tobias was there, having traveled from Albuquerque with his mother, and he wore his good jacket and shook Kieran's hand before the ceremony with the seriousness of someone acknowledging a significant transaction. Violet's sister Clara was there, recovered from her illness and gracious in a way that suggested she had independently assessed Kieran and reached a positive verdict, which he found both touching and slightly intimidating given that it was evidently a family trait. Violet wore a dress the color of the territory sky in August and made her vows in the same clear, certain voice she brought to everything. And Kieran made his with the full understanding of what it meant to stand in front of a man of God and the people you care about and say your actual name, and mean the thing you're promising. After the ceremony, at the small celebration that Violet had organized with characteristic practicality at the Silver Crown's back room, Arlo shook Kieran's hand and said, "Glad you stayed," and nothing else, which was about as much sentiment as Arlo had ever expressed about anything, and which therefore carried enormous weight. That evening, driving back to the ranch in the wagon with Violet beside him, and the stars coming out overhead in the vast dark sky of the territory, Kieran felt something he had not had a name for during the years he'd spent running, something that turned out, now that he was holding it, to be straightforward and simple. He was home. The ranch grew in the years that followed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with the steady accumulation that comes from good decisions made consistently and land worked with knowledge and care. The kitchen garden expanded into a genuine enterprise, with dried produce sold seasonally in Redemption, and eventually contracted to a merchant in Santa Fe. The cattle operation found a rhythm that matched the land's capacity, neither overextended nor underutilized. The south pasture, the one Kieran had re-irrigated in his first weeks at the ranch, produced better hay than it ever had, which improved the winter situation materially. In the spring of 1886, their son was born. They named him Gerald, for Violet's father, which was Violet's suggestion, and Henry, for reasons of Kieran's own that Violet did not press him on, but that had to do with a friend from his earliest years, whose name he had wanted to honor. Gerald Henry Ives arrived in April, red-faced and loud, and took to the world with the apparent conviction that it was an entirely acceptable place, which Kieran found deeply reassuring. Arlo, who had spent the winter moving slightly more slowly, and whose shoulder gave him more trouble than he admitted, held the baby with the careful attention of a man handling something very important and said, "Looks like a tanner." "He looks like a squalling infant," Violet said from the bed with enormous fondness. "Both," Kieran said. He sat beside Violet with the baby between them, and looked at the room he had come to know as thoroughly as he knew anything. The whitewashed walls and the window that looked south toward the creek and the good land beyond it, and thought about the particular way a life can turn on a single decision made at a crossroads, the choice to stop instead of continue, to stay instead of run. The Ives Ranch, as it had come to be called in combination with the Tanner name, so that the sign at the gate read Tanner Ives by the end of 1885, continued to be a working thing, subject to all the working concerns of land and weather and market, and the persistent complications of territory life. Cobb Reiser eventually sold his water rights to a consortium in 1887, when his larger ambitions in the valley collapsed under the combined weight of Marbury's legal challenges and a county commissioner election that went badly for his interests. The rights were purchased through a carefully managed arrangement that Kieran had been quietly preparing for 18 months by the Tanner Ives operation itself, which meant that, for the first time in 5 years, the eastern section was fully theirs. Violet stood at the deed signing in Marbury's office and looked at the document for a long moment before she signed it. "Your father would have liked this," Kieran said. She looked up at him. "He would have liked you," she said. "Eventually. After the warrant business. After." He took her hand. She signed her name, and then he signed his, and Marbury witnessed it, and that was that. Gerald grew up the way children grow up on working land, close to the physical reality of things, with an early and unsentimental understanding of weather and animals, and the patience that productive soil requires. He was a serious child with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, and a disposition that was entirely his own, methodical and curious, and inclined to take things apart to understand how they worked, which was a quality that Kieran recognized and encouraged. In 1889, a daughter arrived. They named her Rose, for no reason more complicated than that Violet liked roses and had planted them along the south side of the house the spring before. And it seemed like a good name for a child born in a year when things were genuinely going well. Rose arrived in September and was immediately and vocally opinionated about everything, which Outlaw said was a sure sign of good character, and which Kieran believed entirely. Outlaw Finch died in the winter of 1890, quietly and in his sleep, which was as good a way as there was. He had been at the Tanner Ranch for 25 years, and the funeral in Redemption was attended by more people than the town's population technically accounted for, which was because people had ridden in from surrounding ranches to pay respects to a man who was known in the territory as the solid, reliable kind. Kieran spoke at the grave and said what was true, that Outlaw had been the most honest person he'd known in his first year in Redemption, which had been a necessary kind of influence. Tobias came from Albuquerque with his mother and stayed a week, and in the conversations during that week, it became clear that he was completing his education and intended to come back to the territory to work. He was 20 now, serious and competent, and over the following year he did come back and took a position at the Tanner Ives Ranch as a genuine hired hand rather than a boy underfoot, and proved so capable that, within 2 years, he was managing the north section independently, which freed Kieran and Violet to focus on the operations that required their specific attention. The territorial warrants, the original ones, the ones that had outlasted the Colorado settlement and the supervised labor period, were formally resolved in 1891 through a general amnesty provision that the territorial legislature passed for crimes more than 10 years old, provided the individual had demonstrated sustained law-abiding conduct. Marbury helped navigate the paperwork, which was extensive and slow-moving, and when the final document arrived at the ranch confirming that the warrants were discharged, Kieran sat at the kitchen table with it for a long time. Violet put her hand on his shoulder. She was standing behind him, looking at the document over his head. "Done," she said. "Done," he said. She bent and kissed the top of his head, and Gerald, who was 5 and interested in everything that happened in the kitchen, looked up from his wooden blocks and said, "What's done?" "Something that needed finishing," Violet said. "Can I have a biscuit?" "Yes," Kieran said. "You can have a biscuit." He found Violet on the porch that evening, the same porch where they had sat in the September dark, 2 years after he had come to the ranch. The same porch with the same view south toward the creek, and the cottonwood trees that were older now and broader. The stars were out and the ranch was quiet and Redemption's lights were a soft glow to the west. "Kieran," she said. He sat beside her. "Yes, I'm glad you overheard that conversation," she said. "In the eating house." He looked at her. "So am I." She leaned against him in the evening quiet, and he put his arm around her, and they looked out at the land together. The land that had been her father's and was now theirs. The land that had held them through bank notes and drought and arson and warrants and grief, and all the ordinary accumulating work of years. The land that their son would grow up on, and that their daughter would learn to love in the specific way you love something that is genuinely yours. The Cimarron Ghost was a name on old posters fading in county offices across the territory. The man it had been attached to was sitting on a ranch porch in the warm New Mexico night with his wife beside him and his children asleep inside, and 2 horses in the paddock, and a stack of accounts on the kitchen table that told the story of a solvent, growing operation that had survived everything its history had thrown at it. He thought about the boy he had been at 17, standing in the ruin of his father's ranch looking at the horizon, and feeling the pull of the wrong road as if it were the only road available. He thought about the years between then and the October morning. He had ridden past the gate with its weathered pine posts. He thought about the particular mercy of second acts, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that erases what came before, but the kind that grows alongside it, that takes the full, complicated truth of a person and makes something honest out of it. Rose woke in the night sometimes, the way babies do. Kieran would hear her before Violet did, which Violet claimed was impossible, and Kieran believed was simply a matter of what you were listening for. He would go to the small room next to the main bedroom and lift Rose out of her cradle and walk the floor with her in the dark, talking in the low voice he used with animals, and with people he was trying not to startle, and she would settle against his chest with a trust that was absolute and unearned, and the most significant thing he had ever been given. Gerald had started asking questions about the ranch's history. He was old enough now to be interested in facts, in the story of how things had come to be what they were. He asked Violet about her father. He asked Kieran about Colorado, about the North, about how he had come to redemption. Kieran answered honestly, in the version appropriate for a 5-year-old, which was that he had needed work and had found it here and had stayed because it was where he belonged. Which was true. Someday Gerald would be old enough for the full version. Kieran thought about that sometimes, the conversation that would come eventually, and felt neither dread nor impatience about it. He would tell his son the truth. He had learned at significant cost the value of that. The ranch in the morning light of a New Mexico autumn was a thing of such particular beauty that he had never gotten accustomed to it, which he took to be a sign that it was genuine beauty rather than just familiarity. The grass still green in the low spots near the creek, the mountains showing blue and permanent to the west, the cattle moving slowly in the south pasture, the horses at the paddock fence, the smoke beginning to come from the kitchen chimney, where Violet was making coffee and biscuits in the early morning. He went inside. She was at the stove with her hair in its morning braid and her old work dress on, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke and something baking, and Gerald was already up and sitting at the table with a piece of paper and a stick of charcoal, drawing something with great seriousness. "What are you drawing?" Kieran asked him. "The ranch," Gerald said, "so I can remember it." "Why would you need to remember it? You live here." Gerald considered this. "I want to remember it from now," he said, with the particular child logic that is often wiser than it sounds. "So when I'm old I know what it looked like." Kieran looked at his son's drawing. The house, the barn, the paddock, the gate with its pine posts, the mountains in the background rendered as a series of triangles. A sun in the corner, the way suns appear in children's drawings, round and specific and certain. "That's a good idea," he said. Violet set a cup of coffee on the table and looked at the drawing, and then at Kieran, and he looked back at her. And in the kitchen morning light of the house, her father had built on the land that was now theirs together. She looked exactly like herself, exactly like the woman who had been on the roof of the barn with a hammer when he had first ridden down the drive with a false name and a saddlebag full of bad history. "Drink your coffee," she said. "The south fence needs checking before it rains." "Yes," he said. He drank his coffee. He went to check the fence. He came back for supper. He sat at his own table in his own house with his wife and his children and his name, his real name, the one that was finally, after 30 years, attached to something he was genuinely proud of. And outside, the territory spread enormous and indifferent and beautiful in every direction, exactly as it always had, exactly as it always would, paying no attention whatsoever to the specific human happiness inside the house on the ranch with the weathered pine gate, which was entirely appropriate, because that happiness was nobody's business but their own.